if raising a child is like designing an adult, what's the purpose of the baby? That means the purpose, the end state of the baby is not determined when he or she is born. It's something that emerges out of the process that we call growing up. And that's what this model allows for. It has literally a placeholder for educational intervention and changes in what the end goal.
What is intelligence and how does it work? This episode of the Navigator podcast is devoted to the wiring of intelligence, a paper that Gunter and several colleagues published last year. They propose a simple model of learning based on a network of connections in the mind. And that's the basis of Gunter's work, examining the process of learning and when education works or does not work.
I'm Gunter. I'm the Senior Director of Advanced Psychometrics with ACTNext, which is a research division in ACT. I'm based in the Netherlands, whilst ACT is based in Iowa City. To start off, let's go back a little over a century. That's when the first intelligence tests were developed. And around the same time, in epidemiology, they started finding out that cancer is a disease that runs in the family. There are families with a lot of people with cancer, and there are those with few. And the question was, why does that happen? And the epidemiologists came up with two explanations. One is, cancer is a genetic disease, and people in one family are genetically more homogeneous than between families. And the second one is cancer is actually a contagious disease, and people in the same family, they spend more time close to one another, and so that's how it works. So they came up with two explanations for this phenomenon, and they quickly found out that these two cannot be distinguished just by counting the occurrences of cancer. Now, at around that same time, intelligence testing started. But we did something different. We came up with just one explanation, being intelligence. The fact that you give more or fewer correct responses on an intelligence test is basically genetic. It's because you are more intelligent that you give more correct responses to an intelligence test. And that has bothered me for a long time. And the wiring of intelligence grew out of that as a means to try and explain why some people give more correct responses from a contagious process. And that's important because that's something which is more malleable. You can intervene in it. If it's in your genes, literally, there's very little we can do about it. You were born to be stupid, and you'll grow up to be stupid, and education is futile, which is sort of a sad outlook. Whereas if it is contagious, you can do something about it. So we set out to collect a list of phenomena that we know about intelligence, both at the population level, cross-sectionally. Everything correlates positively with everything else. Also, in a longitudinal within-person perspective.
Okay.
So intelligence tends to stabilize over time, so we can ever better predict the future.
For an individual or?
For an individual.
Okay.
The differences between people increase over time. So people that are close together when they're 3 years old are likely to end up further apart from each other when they get older. And we build out a minimal theoretical model to explain these findings, which is simple enough so that we can get new predictions from it. And then when we have a new prediction, you go out and collect the data to test the prediction. Either it comes true, and I'm happy, I go back to the drawing board and derive a new prediction, or the prediction does not come true, and I'm equally happy because I go back to the drawing board and I need to revise the theory. But I always end up getting back to the drawing board with my equations on it.
The wiring of intelligence is a network model, and that means that things develop through connections?
Yeah, I'll explain where the wiring comes from.
Okay.
It literally comes from wiring as electrical wiring in a house.
Okay.
So you can think of a person as a house with rooms, and there's the crazy electrician who has to put in the electrical wiring. So he puts sockets in the room, and the sockets you can think of as an item response. either there's electricity on the socket and the response is correct, or there's no electricity and the response is incorrect.
It's unconnected, okay.
Yeah. And the electrician wires these sockets together. And if they're wired together, they either both have electricity or they both don't have electricity. So that's the whole sort of causal mechanism of the model.
Okay.
And whether a set of connected sockets have electricity or not, we consider just to be purely random. And why are there rooms in the house? Because everything correlates with everything else, but some things correlate more with each other than with other things.
Okay.
That's as simple as mathematics questions correlate more with other mathematics questions than they do with reading questions. But they do correlate positively. And within mathematics, algebra questions correlate more with other algebra questions than with geometry ones. So, and the rooms reflect that hierarchical structure. And there's a very simple mechanism. The crazy electrician puts in a little bit more connections, wires, within rooms than between rooms.
Okay.
And that mechanism is enough to explain the full correlational structure you find in an intelligence test, but also in a test like the ACT test.
And this is kind of the positive manifold.
That's what they very fancily call the positive manifold in intelligence testing. It's only everything correlates positively.
So separate rooms have some effect on different rooms.
Yeah.
But more so within that room.
Yeah.
Within algebra, say, there's a higher connection.
Yeah, and this wiring process is different for every person. There's a wiring for your brain, basically. There's one for my brain. They are not completely independent, so the total set of possible wires is the same. But our crazy electrician wired you and wired me, and we are a little bit separate. And what that gives us is that if you go across the population, it looks like we all have weak interactions between all the sockets, but at the individual level that's not true. The wires are there or they are not. And that means that over time, if new sockets are added and get wired to the system, your behavior will be very consistent over time. What they call in a fancy word, the autocorrelation is high at the individual level. You're not like a randomly different person tomorrow than you are today. Mm-hmm. And this wiring mechanism explains why that's the case, because your wiring didn't completely change overnight.
Right.
Maybe one disappears, it disintegrates, some new ones are added.
Slight changes.
But it's small changes over time, but big changes, big differences between persons. And the contagion mechanism in there arises from what this model predicts. It's developed to predict this, is that if two sockets are already indirectly connected, so via a third one or via a whole bunch of other ones, they are a little bit more likely to also get connected directly. And what it gives you is that there is sort of like a big cluster of sockets that are all connected to one another. And that's a very stable structure, because things that are indirectly connected get a little bit more likely directly connected. That means if one wire disintegrates, it's still connected. So that's a robust structure, and that's the contagion mechanism.
And that backs up what I know about the brain, is that if you remove part of the brain, wires form around it and kind of make up for that absence.
Yeah. There is excess connections to make your brain, well, it's not directly a model of the brain, but to make your cognitive structure robust against some connections disintegrating over time. So otherwise you have a very fragile brain. If one of your neurons would disappear, that you would no longer function, that would be sort of an issue.
And this network forms naturally, so it's constantly updating and making new connections and reinforcing connections.
Yes, but it is so in a malleable way. And that's what we call education. If you think of a vocabulary network, then I'm Dutch speaking. I learned English, but my network of English vocabulary is very dense and big in terms that have to do with statistics, with psychometrics.
Okay.
I don't know a whole lot of English words having to do with gardening or cooking. So it's specialized in a particular area. Whereas somebody else who is maybe also Dutch speaking, but who happens to be a cook, working in the US in a 3-star restaurant, that person will have a very large vocabulary network with lots of intricate connections having to do with cooking.
Right.
But he probably wouldn't know what a point by serial correlation is. And that not only goes for vocabulary, but for all things. So you can decide or intervene in how the network grows. There is no preset end state. You literally build the end state. And in a meeting a while ago, I summarized this as follows. If raising a child is like designing an adult, what's the purpose of the baby? And of course, everybody laughed about that. But there is a serious part of it. It means the purpose, the end state of the baby is not determined when he or she is born. It's something that emerges out of the process that we call growing up. And that's what this model allows for. It has literally a placeholder for educational intervention and changes in what the end goal is, whereas the genetic idea about intelligence is more like a child is more like a cannonball, which we aim at conception and then we shoot off the cannonball. There may be some randomness due to the wind or something, but where the cannonball is going to end up is pretty much set in stone. And that's also a pretty sad perspective for education.
Yeah.
Whereas from our perspective, you have the potential to intervene, to change the course, to go back if you find out that some link which you would like to have been there is missing. You can go back and remediate the missing link, literally.
Have we explained the positive manifold and how that relates enough, do you think?
Yeah, it's a necessary consequence of the theory. That also means that it cannot be negative. So correlations have to be positive.
Okay.
Being better at something has to go with being better at something else.
Okay.
Not with being worse.
Okay.
There's also a difference with the more traditional factor analysis models, a century of intelligence testing. They allow for any correlation between anything. But we don't just find any correlation, we always find positive ones. And this theory says it has to be positive.
So if I have a mistaken idea, that affects negatively. Is that true? If I have a wrong conception of part of the world?
That will go with a particular group of connected things that depend on it. Say if you mistake addition or multiplication for addition.
Okay.
You will give a structured set of incorrect responses. You will say 9 times 9 is 18.
Right.
And 3 times 2 is 5. So that gives positive correlation because these wrong responses go together. But because that's something at the individual level, that cannot happen for everybody. And so for over the whole population, the correlations are positive. Whereas within the individual, there can be groups of things which are all negative due to a misconception.
Okay.
That can be fixed, and then they would all flip.
Okay.
So if I talk to the child, I explain, no, you don't have to add the numbers, you have to multiply, and we work on it a bit. She sees the light. Then all of a sudden, 9 times 9 becomes 81, 2 times 3 becomes 6. That's how the model was built.
Okay. How did you start on this wiring of intelligence? What was your inspiration, or who were you studying, or take us through kind of the birth of...
It started with the epidemiology problem and with the realization that the models we've been using for intelligence and for education in general, they are based on there is this thing called ability that you have, which in very strict interpretations is genetically encoded. You can't change it. And that causes your responses to be correct or incorrect. And that makes education futile. It doesn't add or fit together. It explains large-scale educational testing, large-scale intelligence testing. That's cross-sectional data, but it cannot explain individual learning. I mean, it's pretty clear that learning does take place, and we started out almost 10 years ago thinking seriously about that. And why 10 years ago? Because if you want to study learning, you need to be there when it happens. And having a researcher looking over the shoulder of every kid in the K to 12 area all day long is like a pretty heavy lift. But computers do help. So these online learning systems, they do have the potential to have us virtually be there while the learning takes place.
Okay.
And then you get into a chicken and egg problem. You need to have some idea what you're going to do with those data before people are going to be willing to start collecting them. So this effort is part of that, to get to a theoretical understanding. What are the things we would or should be looking at or could be looking at once we start getting data on large numbers of learners with a very high frequency, like daily.
And what is the test like, or how do you gather this information?
Well, one of the predictions we are currently in the process of testing is best summarized by the opening lines of Anna Karenina by Tolstoy, which are all happy families are happy in the same way, all unhappy families are unhappy in their own way.
Okay.
Now, if you replace happy by something like dyslexic or depressed or something else, that's a prediction that comes out of this theoretical model, that the cohesion, the correlational structure between symptoms of dyslexia should be lower for people who are actually dyslexic. They have more symptoms, more spelling errors, more reading mistakes, but they all have their own individual pattern of dyslexia. And that's a testable prediction, that's non-trivial. If it's true, it corroborates our model. If not, we need to revise the model. And it has direct implications for remediation, because it means you need to deal with every patient of dyslexia, but also of depression, individually. And there's no one-size-fits-all therapy for dealing with dyslexic students.
Like education, there's no one-size-fits-all.
There's no one-size-fits-all.
Okay.
It has to be personalized. And so we're in the process of what you need for that is, at the minimum, data from a sample of students, some of which you know are dyslexic, otherwise others you know they are not dyslexic. Give them a test and look at what the correlations between the responses look like, and they are supposed to be lower for the dyslexics.
So how do you measure the network of intelligence?
The because these two classes of models are statistically equivalent, or one is a subclass of the others. So the cross-sectional measurement doesn't really change. Everything that goes with the item response theory model still goes with this network model. But over time, it's a different thing, and at the individual level, it's different. Because if you think about the electrical analogy, finding two sockets who are in a different state, one has electricity, the other does not, tells us that there is no connection between them. If they both have electricity, we don't know whether they are connected. It could be, could not be. But if they're in a different state, we know for sure they are not connected.
Okay.
And if we think there should be a connection between these two concepts or questions, we can intervene on that.
Okay.
So not having learned a connection is something we can observe. We cannot observe whether you have learned a connection.
That's the limit of what you're doing.
Yeah, that's what the theory as it currently is says.
You don't know what you don't know, kind of thing.
Yeah.
One of my questions here is, what are the limits of your network intelligence, the wiring of intelligence?
Well, as a theory intended to put an alternative on the table. But if you think about how children take an actual intelligence test or an ACT test, the response they give comes out of a process. And that's not the way it's in the current theoretical model. There are, for responses to test items, there are no direct interactions between the questions. That's different in other fields. In psychopathology, if you are depressed, it's highly plausible that there are direct relations between the symptoms, because they exist also if I don't look at them. But fortunately for you, in your brain, every question that has ever been on an ACT test does not exist at this moment in your brain. The response emerges out of a process that starts when I ask you the question. And we know that we need to move in that direction. So this is certainly not an end point. It's more like a starting point. And to get attention for the idea that there could be different explanations for what we see in large-scale educational or intelligence testing than these latent variables. And so we need to work in that direction. But for that, we first will need the type of time series data at high frequency to start studying. Because it's like in Sherlock Holmes, it's a capital mistake to start theorizing without data. So we first need facts, and then we can find out more about what the actual response process looks like, out of which the response you give emerges, and how these processes relate to one another for different questions. Because if I ask 4 times 6, something happens in your brain that gives the response. And if I ask you the question 2 times 3, something happens as well, and it's not orthogonal to the other one. These processes are related. And there is, at that level, probably more sort of a wiring mechanism. But at this moment, we mainly have a lack of high-quality data so that we can find out what are the regularities in all these individual learning processes, because those we can add to the collection of things that we know. And then we need to start thinking about what is the simplest non-trivial model that implies all of these phenomena. Because that's the way you build a theory. You take facts and you say, okay, we always see these 20 facts. What is the simplest story that explains why we see these 20 facts, and nothing different, they have to happen. And now we first need to wait until we have 20 additional facts that relate to actual learning and change and the effects of intervention and other things. And then with those new facts, we go back to our drawing board. Say, okay, given those facts, what is the simplest non-trivial theory that explains why these take place?
And this is where you're talking about you want to observe day to day, even maybe minute by minute, the process of making connections.
Yeah. You want to be there at the moment when a child realizes something.
Yeah.
And then you know when it happens, what the kid was doing. If you think of a big learning system with educational resources and quizzes, you see, if a kid watched this particular YouTube video explaining this particular concept, then with high probability it clicks. And if you quiz them after, you see, okay, they caught on to it. And if they catch on to this, then they can move ahead to a more complicated concept. It's like if you have in biology, you have to understand the concept of osmosis.
Okay.
You need to understand diffusion. And you need to know what a semi-permeable membrane is. If either of those two are missing, you're never going to catch on to osmosis as a process. And those are things we want to be able to observe. We see, hey, this kid probably did not catch on to a sufficient level what diffusion is. And so there's no point in giving him another video or lecture on osmosis. We need to take a step back, fix this problem, and then we can see whether that helped in getting an understanding of osmosis. And if we have a collection of possible interventions, say, read a chapter in a book, watch 1 of 5 videos, talk to your teacher, and we have a sufficient number of students, you can figure out which one works best. And that allows you to optimize education, also at a personal level. You can find out maybe for boys this video is better and for girls this chapter works better.
Okay.
You can do that at a fairly fine-grained level, but it allows you to optimize the interventions. By that you can experiment and get a grip on how the process actually works. And that also goes back to the epidemiology people, because from just counting the occurrences of cancer, you can't distinguish the two mechanisms.
Yeah.
But if you think of a disease like Ebola, And suppose there are a bunch of outbreaks, say 10 of them. For 5 of them, you quarantine the people who have the disease, and for 5 you don't. Within 2 days, you know whether Ebola is contagious or genetic. And that's the way they do it. We need to find a similar way to do experimental intervention, because that does allow us to tease apart these 2 possible explanations, which with the data we have today are equivalent, so they have the same explanatory power. But if you can intervene in the system, you can find out whether it is contagious, whether it's genetic, or likely some mix of the 2.
Okay, so we talked about the limits of your model, and you used this George Box quote, "All models are wrong, but some models are useful." And so, how is your model wrong, and how is it useful?
Well, I explained a bit on how it's wrong, that it doesn't take into account the process, that there are likely not direct interactions between responses to test questions. But the model is useful in that it's highly simplified. In the whole model, there are 2 parameters, one relating to the probability of getting a wire within a room, and another one a little bit lower between rooms. So it doesn't get much simpler than that, but that allows us to derive detailed qualitative predictions from it. Like this Tolstoy quote we talked about before, which you can test with data. If you have a very detailed model with lots of parameters, it's very difficult to get new predictions out of it, because the more degrees of freedom you add, the more parameters, the more things you are allowing to occur in reality. And at the end of the day, you don't explain anything anymore. You may describe very well what's happening, but it's not very easy to make sense of why does this happen. And it's also highly likely, if you keep adding parameters, that there are multiple ways in which the same thing can happen. That's why the model is wrong, but we don't care about it, but it's useful because we can get new predictions out of it, which we can test to revise the model and replace it with a probably equally simple but slightly different model.
What's next for your project? Will you be using computer-based testing?
Yeah, and next is a whole lot of things. One is testing predictions on this particular version of the theoretical model. The other one is feeding into the theory information that we have about what the structure of cognition is. ACT developed the ACT hierarchical framework, and that's basically a categorization of what the rooms look like.
The holistic framework?
Yeah.
Okay.
So you have an office, there are larger areas, that's big rooms. In it are cubicles, which are smaller rooms.
Okay.
What the holistic framework maps out is that structure. Which things in mathematics are most closely related to which other things? And do that at various levels. So you have like linear equations and quadratic equations, they belong to algebra, they belong to mathematics, they belong to the curriculum in the end, and it goes much more fine-grained. And that information we can use, because that tells me what the potential collection of wires is.
Okay.
And then everybody gets sort of a subset of these, but at least we then have an idea what the potential structure looks like. And then we can build a more concrete instantiation of the model that's being developed currently. It's called the ACT master model, which is closely related, but it's not just an abstract model, it's a more concrete one that you can connect to real data on learning and assessment systems. And my group works on theories, statistical models, and methods, that's statistical algorithms, to support learning, measurement, and navigation. That gives like a nice 3x3 table with 9 cells in it. The problem is with what we know currently, there is no one coherent approach that connects all these 9 cells together. So the overarching theme is to come up with theories, models, and methods that work for learning, measurement, and navigation. That's the work in progress. It will take a while to finish that. At this moment, we're mostly working on the learning and measurement part. And that's mainly because we have more information on that, more empirical data. And the navigation part, that's intervention in the learning system. For that, we need to get a high quality up and running learning system at scale, so we can also bring that on board. We want to just fill these 9 cells so that it all fits together as one system.
Good. We can stop there, and thanks, Gunter.
You're welcome. It was fun, so...
Good.
Yeah.
Okay, take care. That's our show. Thank you for listening, and thanks again to Gunter Maris for joining us. Have you heard about EDU 2050 and the creative thinking test being developed for PISA 2021? Find out about ACTNext prototypes at actnext.org/prototypes and learn about our latest projects and ongoing research at actnext.org/projects.